Hey guys, before we begin tonight's journey, please take a moment to settle in. Find the position that feels most comfortable for your body. Release any areas where you feel tight. Let your shoulders drop and start to slowly lay down the day's fatigue you've been carrying. Tonight, we will follow a noblewoman in Old England through an entire day. From the first candle lit before dawn to the last candle brought back to her bedroom at night. There is nothing here that requires you to be tense or on edge. The story will unfold gently with the rhythm of your breath, carrying you softly into sleep. If these peaceful journeys help you rest, we warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel so that whenever you need it, another night like this can find you. A quiet like or a few words below telling us where you are listening tonight will help more people discover these stories. There is no rush to do this. You can wait until the morning or any moment you remember. Right now, none of this asks anything of you. Now, there is only the warmth surrounding you, the night slowly falling, a long and gentle story waiting to begin. If your eyes are feeling tired or heavy, close them. Adjust your breathing slowly. When you're ready, we will step into a cold stone chapel where in the fading darkness, a small candle has just been lit. This town is called Clare, located in the lowlands of eastern England, where fields stretch flat to the horizon. It is an autumn in the middle of the 14th century, after the crops have been harvested. The nights are growing longer. Somewhere in the dark, a river flows slowly past a mill. On a gentle slope above the houses stands a grey stone castle. Its great hall, kitchen and chapel, together with a window about to light up, create a beautiful scene. Inside that castle lives a woman I want you to meet. Her name is Elizabeth de Burgh, the lady of this place. She was born noble, a granddaughter of the king. She has been married 3 times and worn black mourning 3 times. Now, she lives alone as a widow, as she has for many years, ruling over wide lands so vast that riding for days and nights would not take you beyond them. You might think a life like hers would be full of drama. It is not. This will be one of the quietest and most peaceful lives you are invited into. Tonight, we will not look at wars or listen to alliances, nor care for the great changes outside. We will only follow this day. An ordinary day from the cold moments before dawn to the last candle extinguished at night, experiencing the good life inside the home she manages. There are countless things that need tending. Think about it. How much must a household like this maintain? Bread and malt beer, fish brought from the seacoast, wine shipped by boat across the ocean, wool and furs, candles counted one by one, and long scrolls with neat handwriting recording every penny spent. The servants each have their roles: her chambermaid, the valet in charge of the wardrobe, the cook, the groom, the boy carrying firewood. All of this turns slowly around her like a great wheel. She sits near the center, watching, deciding, keeping everything orderly and well arranged. We will stand beside her and accompany her through it all, not to study her closely or rush her, just being there, in the rooms where she spends long hours, noticing the small things she notices. The cold of the stone floor before the fire is lit, the weight of a key, the sound of rain outside. When most inside are still asleep, their breathing matches the breathing of the old house. If you have ever wondered what a noblewoman's real life was made of, not what is carved on her tombstone, but the ordinary parts measured in candles, bread, and fish prices, then this is the home where you can find out. There is nothing you need to remember. You can let it flow past like water. We are only passing through this incredibly slow day in a place vanished 600 years ago, and soon it will feel as if you have been there yourself. Let the town sink below our feet into darkness. Let the last light fade away. Now, please come with me as we climb the stone steps, walk up the cold stairs, and enter a small room where, before the whole house wakes, a lone flame is already flickering. In the hour before dawn, Clare's castle was colder than at any other time of day. The fire in the great hall had died down to grey embers overnight. The stones slowly gave back their faint warmth to the darkness. Outside, fields were wrapped in a thin mist, and a river flowed quietly somewhere beneath the castle walls. Everything inside the manor was still asleep. The stable hands slumbered in the straw. The kitchen servants rested beside the cold hearth. In a high room within the castle, behind heavy curtains that kept out the draughts, a woman had just opened her blurry eyes. She was Elizabeth de Burgh, the lady of the house. She had lived here much longer than most around her. She knew she had been waking at the same hour for years, rising on her own in the darkness like clockwork. She lay quietly beneath the thick bedding a while longer, feeling the warmth her body had gathered throughout the night. The air above the blankets was sharp and biting. Without opening her eyes, she knew what this morning would bring. But before anything began, before the manor stirred, before any order was given, there was only this moment. The first hour was a time of peace. It was the time she reserved for herself and for God. Let us keep her company in this hour and take it in slowly, just like she does. She rose in the dark, guided by habit, finding the familiar small items at her side. The robe prepared the night before. The floor cold beneath her feet, but she would not let the chill touch her for long. A candle stood unlit at the bedside, with fire-making tools beside it. The first small task of the day, to wake a lonely flame. When it flickered to life, it started as a faint blue glow, then grew steady and bright, revealing the corners of the room in its light. The carved bedposts, shadows cast by a chest against the wall, and herself, breath ghost white in the candlelight. The room was cold enough to see her breath turn to frost. She did not call anyone. At this hour, she did not need anyone. A woman who spent entire days surrounded by servants, who always had someone waiting for her orders just next door, would come to cherish this 1 hour of complete solitude, belonging only to herself. I often think of this hour and what it means for a woman like her. In the long day ahead, she would be at the center of everything. People would come with questions, accounts, worries, endless family business. She would have to make decisions, arrange things, and set things right. But in the cold before dawn, none of that had started. There was no one to answer to, no one who needed answers. In this brief time, she was no one's master. She was simply a person awake in the dark, carrying a candle, her own thoughts, and a habit of long-standing prayer. The room had a low door leading to a small chapel, barely bigger than a closet, reserved just for her. The castle's great chapel was elsewhere, near the hall, where later the whole household would gather for mass. But this little space was hers alone. She carried the candle inside. The air grew colder still, filled with a dim scent of old wax, stone, and dried herbs spread on the floor to keep damp at bay. A small altar, a cross, maybe a painted panel, faint in the low light, depicting the Virgin Mary or a saint she had long admired. She set down the candle, its tiny flame casting her shadow tall and still against the wall. This was where the day truly began. She knelt slowly to say her first prayers of the morning. The ancient books called them Matins and Lauds, prayers said before daybreak, while night receded and before the light of day arrived. Mostly, she did not need the books. She had spoken these words thousands of times, and they rose naturally from her heart. The Latin was as familiar to her as a childhood song, its sound rounded and worn smooth by time like river stones. Her lips moved, her breath showed in the candlelight. These ancient words were far older than she was. Countless others had spoken them in the dark, and that was part of the comfort. She was not creating something new. She was joining a tradition so old that it continued whether she was there or not. If you have ever woken before anyone else in a quiet house and felt like you were the only one in the dark, you might understand what this room meant. The same stillness, the same feeling of being cut off from the usual world. For her, it was no surprise. It was the most familiar thing in the world, the cornerstone of her entire day, the one piece that remained forever the same while everything else changed. There might be a small book by the candle, what her era called a primer or a prayer book, hand-copied and illustrated, and hugely valuable. Such books were among the most precious possessions of a noblewoman. The pages listed prayers to say at every hour of the day, and in the margins, hand-drawn little scenes, a bird, a golden leaf, a face. She must have turned those pages so often some corners were worn soft. By candlelight, she found her place or continued from memory. There was no rush in doing this. No one timed her. The length of prayer depended entirely on her devotion. This morning, like most mornings, she was in no hurry to finish. Let us pause for a moment on that little flame. The candle burning here was no ordinary one, unlike those lit in the kitchens after the manor woke. Those were tallow candles made from filtered animal fat, cheap, smoky, and harsh, suited only for the scullery. The chapel's candles were beeswax, pure white and clear burning, far more expensive, reserved for the altar and noble rooms. Families like hers accounted tightly for everything, candles and all goods brought through the gate carefully tallied and recorded. Using the best light for the chapel was never in question. Around that small flame stood the sacred objects she tended in half-light. A cloth embroidered with silk and gold thread spread across the altar. A cross, perhaps a relic kept in a small silver box, a fragment made holy by long faith, kissed on special days of the year. These were her most treasured possessions, more precious than gold or jewels. Someday, she planned to donate the best pieces to a school she dreamed of founding, so even when she was gone, prayers would echo between the stones. In her grandmother's time and her own, some measured a lady's virtue by this. A wealthy widow, with time and money, but no husband to serve, could fill most of her days with prayer if she wished. Some did, living almost like nuns within their high walls without taking vows. Elizabeth was not one of them. She was both a devout woman of prayer and a sharp, capable manager, as the coming day would prove. But these did not conflict in her. Accounting and prayer were parts of the same life, handled by the same careful hands. Anyone who thought those things opposed each other was someone she could not understand. To her, keeping the household in order and praying with full devotion were two parts of the same loyalty. Even now, she was not as alone as the silence might suggest. Imagine the town beneath the castle, still shrouded in darkness, every door and window tightly shut against the cold. Among them were monks she had known for years, brothers supported by her yearly gifts. They also woke at this hour, saying matins in their cold churches, chanting the same ancient morning prayers she said up here on the hill. Across the country, in monasteries, hermitages, and little chapels like this one, the same thing happened in the same dark. The quiet presence of a vast, unseen crowd turning in one direction at the very same time. She could not hear their voices, but she knew they were there. praying before dawn was never a wholly solitary act. It was a way of finding a small place in a great, hushed undertaking that lasted through the night and would not end when the sun rose. Within these high walls were also those who made prayer their work. In the great chapel beside the hall, paid clerics and chapel clerks recited and sang the daily offices. Like cooks and stable hands, they were part of the household, their names written on the roll of employment, receiving cloth and wages like everyone else. When the household sang the morning mass, it would be their voices leading, cross. But at this hour, before all that began, they had no role to play. What she was doing now was entirely for herself, needing no one's help or witness. The prayers paid for by others at the chapel, and those she kept in this little room alone, were not the same thing. She preserved both, and losing either would feel like a loss. Long ago, when she was a little girl, she had learned these words. Like every child of her rank, kneeling beside mother or nurse and stumbling through Latin until it stopped sounding strange. The illustrated primer that taught her to read probably taught her prayers too. For girls in her family, reading and devotion were learned from the same page. Now she was an old woman. That little girl who had first babbled these words was far away, almost another person. But the words remained the same. It was a curious gift of this way of life. No matter what else changed, and a great many things had this morning's prayers, spoken into the darkness, word for word, were the same prayers she had said as a child in another house, in another time, beside another little flame, long extinguished. At this hour, her thoughts were also with others. It was both a duty and a comfort. She had outlived many, endured more than most. Her late husband, a brother, friends, and all those bright companions of her youth had entered that same darkness she was walking through in prayer. On days when she remembered them, she would have masses sung and alms given, so the remembrance would not fade. But even on an ordinary morning like today, she thought of some of their names in her mind, like holding a warm stone in cold hands. It was not heavy. It was calm, worn smooth by time, and gentle somehow. Remembering them was just part of waking before dawn. In this year, too, there were bright moments mixed into the quiet. There was a favourite festival, held in early summer, when the days were long and the church was dressed for the occasion. On that day, her family would open their purses more generously than almost any other time. It was a newer festival, one her grandmother might not have known, having only recently arrived in England and swiftly taking root. This cold autumn morning was months away from that festival, but she knew it would come, just like you know a season you love will turn in its time. The dark mornings would not last forever. They were simply the place where the wheel had paused, just now. The candle had burned a little shorter. Outside the small window, black was thinning, letting in a sliver of grey. It was the first sign of morning, so faint you could miss it if you did not watch closely. Far below, faint noises began. A door, a bucket set down, the manner's first small clearing of the throat. Whether she called for it or not, the day was coming. She was in no rush to meet it. Slow as at first, she ended her prayers, her last words whispered into the cold. Then she lingered on her knees a little longer, not hurried to rise, letting the silence settle like snow across the ending prayer. The flame flickered once, then steadied. The shadows on the wall stayed still, just one more breath, and the whole vast manor was still hers, sleeping beneath her feet, whole and unharmed at this hour, with nothing in the world she had to do yet. Then she rose gently. She took up the candle, she turned toward her bedroom, ready to face the new day, leaving the small chapel to its darkness. There the cross waited quietly, and the dried herbs lay on the cold stone. The chill would keep its patient watch, waiting for her return. The first morning light filtered through the windows of Clare Castle, and the massive estate began to wake up from bottom to top. It did not happen all at once. It started in an orderly way, with the people on the lowest levels and the busiest ones stirring first. In the lower courtyard, the groom rolled over in the straw, sat up, and braved the chill to tend the horses. In the kitchen, a boy knelt before the hearth still warm from last night, gently blowing on the buried embers until the first flicker of new fire appeared and smoke began to rise slowly. A girl was drawing water. A man was unlatching a door. One small sound called another awake until the entire castle murmured softly to itself in half light, like a beehive buzzing to life before a day of work. Let us step into this waking household and see just how many hands it takes to keep such a large family running. It takes a great many hands. A household like this might hold 50 or 60 souls, sometimes even more, all supported and clothed and housed by the lady of the house, together forming what the word retainers means. They were never a disorganized crowd. They were a well-ordered class, tightly divided from top to bottom, like anything else in the kingdom. Every year, cloth for making clothes was distributed, that is, uniforms, and a roster was drawn up to record it, a list that became a map of this tiny world. The roster began with the highest-ranking knights, then went down through maids, clerks, attendants, senior servants, junior clerks, chambermaids, junior servants, tenant farmers, grooms, and finally pages the youngest and lowest in status. On this list, everyone knew their place. They knew who stood above and below them. This brought great comfort, a feeling hard to find in modern times. To know exactly where you belong is to know you are truly accepted. Upstairs in the bedchambers, the lady had already returned, and her maids gathered around her. Some of their names have lived on to this day. Susanna de Necton and Anne de Lexton had served her for many years and would continue to do so in the years to come, until the end of their lives. The lady would remember them with gifts of silverware and clothing. Margaret de Necton was also one of her chambermaids. Others moved quietly about the room, preparing the day's clothes, bringing warm water, tending the fire burning in the hearth. Somewhere below, the laundry servants had long been at work. In a family of this size, that work never stopped. Among the many male servants, the women were a small group, but the closest to the lady, the faces she saw first in the morning and last at night. I found in this scene a quiet, moving power. Here, a woman ruled her small domain like a queen. The waking and sleeping of dozens revolved around her routine. This morning was made up of ordinary things: warm water, robes prepared, and the low voices of maids who had accompanied her half her life. Seen close up, each morning repeated the same gentle labour until it grew, day after day, into a kind of love never spoken aloud. Dressed and ready, she moved toward another heart of the house. In her life, there were effectively two offices, and they had to be kept separate. One was her bedroom, where she slept, prayed, and sat with her maids. The other office was not a place for resting, but the whole estate's accounting chamber, where funds were stored and accounts drawn up. Morning business now shifted toward that office, or rather, the person who ran it. A great family did not stand on goodwill alone. It ran on reckoning, on patient records of every item coming in and going out. and at the centre of this record-keeping sat the lady herself. Imagine the vastness of this work. It was a miracle in itself. Every department in the house kept its own accounts, which were gathered together daily. The bakery managed bread. The cellar managed malt and wine. The kitchen took care of meat and fish. The poultry house managed birds, eggs and butter. The spice room handled sauces, and even the scullery was accountable for dishes. The stables looked after the horses and their feed. Each section, day after day, reported its ledgers to the wardrobe clerk, and all these were combined into a single roster. In clear, practiced handwriting, the daily expenses were sorted and recorded. The same roster also listed visiting guests who had dined at her table and who had ridden through her main gate. Nothing was too small to write down. A family that could not account for even a penny could never safeguard its pounds, and she knew this truth well. The person who kept this all running held the title of wardrobe keeper, the one in charge of the wardrobe. In a household of this size, that term meant far more than just a place to keep clothes. The wardrobe was the treasury and engine of the whole estate, storing clothes, funds, and records. The wardrobe keeper was effectively the lady's chief financial officer. For several years, a man named John de Wren held this post. Under him and around him, clerks, junior clerks, and assistants had their roles, copying, totaling, and checking accounts. At year's end, everything was compiled into a massive ledger, and a reconciliation roll was made, with daily and weekly sums of money and goods arrayed along one side, and a summarized version of the entire account on the other. Trust alone was not enough. Every account was audited, examined by other eyes to make sure the numbers told the truth. Financial accounting changed according to the house's needs at the time. In years when children needed nurturing and schooling, separate accounts were drawn up solely for them. In years when goldsmiths came behind the walls to carefully craft their work, they too received a special ledger to separate their gold materials and labour costs from the daily bread and malt. Whatever the castle set out to do, the ledgers grew a new column to match it. Above the largest matters stood senior officers, the steward and the receiver, tasked with gathering rents from her scattered estates and ensuring that sums, sometimes reaching about £2,000 in a good year, were properly collected, guarded, and spent only as they should be. Beneath them were clerks. Beneath clerks were wood tally marks and ledger rolls. And beneath it all was a simple daily truth. A family that kept meticulous accounts, down to a penny, is a family that never needs to feel afraid. Some tasks fell to particular men who made them their special duties. A family of this size could not buy everything in one place or from one person, so certain servants took on fixed responsibilities year after year, each in charge of a certain supply. One servant named Hugh Le Prouet had entered her service young, and across many years his core duty was to buy fish. In a household strictly observant of church fast days and eating fish on many days of the year, this was no small thing. When needed, he also bought other things: salt and honey, pigs and sheep, even rough leather to line carts and keep goods dry on the road. Another man, John de Sotherham, had wine buying as his specific task. To us, these are just names in old ledgers. But each name stood for a practical man, familiar with the routes and known faces in the markets, trusted to bring back good goods without ever being cheated on price. A great family was built on dozens of such steady hands, each small alone, but together holding up the entire household. You might wonder if it was unusual for a woman to run a machine made of money and men. It was not as rare as you might think. A noble widow was expected to manage her affairs, and great women ran estates as broad and complex as any lord's. She learned the work as a wife and grew more skilled as a widow until she could read ledgers as easily as a page of prayers and quickly spot an incorrect figure, just as a careful officer would hope. There was a unique authority in this, quieter than a knight's and lasting far longer. A knight's power faded with his arm. Hers lasted as long as her wit, and all signs showed her sharp mind endured to the end. There was more than one house to manage. A woman of her rank did not live fixed like a stone set in earth. She and her retainers moved between her several great houses, following the seasons or business, with people and goods moving too. A whole lifestyle folded up and was carried along roads, then unfolded and settled again in a new place. When she left, not everyone went with her. A smaller, core team stayed behind to watch the place she had left, and even that reduced team kept faithful accounts, ensuring nothing slipped through while the lady was away. One summer, the lady was far away in her western holdings, and a trusted man named Henry de Collingham kept Clare for her, submitting its accounts as she did. The machine did not stop just because she left a room or even a county. It was built to run wherever she was, and to run quietly where she was not. Below the clerks and fine ledgers, at the base of this vast foundation, were those who actually carried loads, fetched things, and swept floors, the forgotten lowest people, the grooms and pages. Many of them were known only by the posts they served. A man might be called Robert of the Wardrobe or Robert of the Bedchamber. A boy might be Adam of the Poultry or Adam of the Bakery. The boy tending the lady's horses might not even have a recorded given name. He was simply the nimble horse page, and that was enough to identify him. In such a place, a boy could rise over time. One who began as a page might be advanced to groom, and a groom, long later, when the lady wrote her will, might receive a small sum as reward for loyal years. What held this whole picture together was less the hierarchy and ledgers than the time of these people. Serving in such a family was often a lifetime commitment, sometimes spanning generations, a household dedicating itself across long years to another household. There was a young woman, Elizabeth Marshall, who served the lady and married under her watch. Her lady did an important thing. She attended the wedding and gave the bride cloth and fur as gifts. Think what that meant, a great lady finding her place at a servant's wedding. Among retainers she could entirely have left to their own devices. And when she finally wrote down what was to be handed out after her, she did not forget the humble. The grooms of the bedchamber, the grooms of the cellar, each was named and left money. Men who began as wood carriers and later rose to groom status were remembered in gold and by their clearly written names. This family's order was strict and sharply hierarchical, but woven through it, like a warm thread in coarse cloth, was something that looked very much like affection. By now, the entire castle was fully awake. The hearth fire roared, the smells of morning rose, the scent of wood smoke, baking bread, and damp stones in the courtyard. Doors that had been bolted an hour before were now wide open. The murmurs had turned into a working buzz, the sound of 50 lives revolving around the still centre that was a woman's will. She simply waking sparked this day to begin. Somewhere, a clerk dipped his pen in ink. Somewhere, a tally mark was cut into wood, a notch representing a debt or delivery, simple, ancient, and trusted. The reckoning had begun and would quietly go on beneath all other things all day, as it always did. For a moment, the lady stood at the centre of it all, listening as her retainers found their rhythm. She turned to the morning's first task, whatever it might be, and this vast, delicate machine gently closed around her, carrying her as it carried everyone onward through the day. In your mind, follow your thoughts downward into the lower rooms of the manor, the cool, dim places where a whole year's worth of supplies are stored. The air here is completely different, heavier and filled with the scent of grain, salt, and old wood. Burlap sacks packed with wheat, barley, and malt sit heavily in a row, leaning against the wall. Wooden barrels stand silently in the dark, some filled with malt liquor, some with wine, and some holding preserved foods meant to last through the entire winter. There are oat bins for feeding horses, jars of honey, blocks of salt, and somewhere nearby you can catch a faint hint of briny sea air, a smell that truly does not belong in this flat inland countryside. For a large household, the most important business is to be fed, day in, day out, feeding 50 to 60 people, along with their horses and guests. Much of this family's life consists simply of that long, patient task, gathering it all piece by piece into these cool rooms before it is needed. So let's trace back to the most essential question downstairs. Where does it all come from? In fact, there are two main sources. The first source is the land itself, her own land. A lady of her standing owns estates scattered across the country which are not just sources of rent, but working farms, sending grain and livestock to supply their owners. Much of the wheat used for baking bread, as well as barley and malt for brewing malt liquor, come this way, carried from her own fields to her own front door, bringing the produce of her own land to her own table. There is an ancient and satisfying wholeness to this. The bread on the wooden table grew from the soil she owns, was harvested by hands she pays, then brought home along roads that belong entirely to her. These homegrown grains produce the two staples everyone in the manor eats and drinks day after day, bread and malt liquor. They are not luxuries, but fundamental survival essentials made on site. In the bakehouse, dough is kneaded and slid oven after oven into the great hearth. Darker bread for the servants' table, finer and whiter bread for the main table. In the brewery, malt is mashed into malt liquor which, in an age when plain water wasn't always safe, was the drink for all people, morning and night, old and young alike. It usually has a low alcohol content, is full of nutrition, and is brewed fresh again and again because it cannot keep well. Imagine the enormous quantity needed. Bread and malt liquor, enough for 60 people every day, and even more when guests arrived by horse. Fires in the ovens never stayed out for long, and brewing never stopped for long either. Beneath all the fine things consumed in the manor, this was the broad and steady foundation, a daily plenty so ordinary no one gave it much thought. No single estate could supply everything, so the second source came from the wider world goods bought with coins at markets and fairs. Just outside her own estate gate, there was convenience. The two towns of Clare and Bury St. Edmunds each had their own markets. The market just outside was a quiet treasure, the place where local countryside brought goods weekly to sell. Beyond the market was the fair, a grand annual gathering that attracted sellers from afar. Among her household was a man named John Goff, a servant in charge of the stables, who had to find enough hay, oats, and straw bedding for all her horses. To do this, he travelled all over the country. He shopped at the nearby Clare and Bury Street, Edmunds markets, but also went further to the great fair at Stourbridge near Cambridge, to Wisbeck, and a long list of small places whose names still appear on maps today: Dunmow and Stibbington, Bardwell and Glastonbury. Each name marked a journey. Each journey was a horse-drawn cart laden with winter feed, slowly making its way home. Behind all these purchases was a quietly operating money machine. The house steward in charge of expenses could not spend at will. He was given fixed sums, some weekly for everyday spendings, others reserved for major bulk purchases, wine, oats, cloth, and furs, all of which had to be bought in large quantities and with care. Some of the money came from her own estates as paid rent, some from selling excess manor goods, so money flowed out and back in simultaneously. Every transaction was recorded, every agreement stamped and confirmed between officials, ensuring no single pound sterling slipped away unchecked. This discipline, linking money and needs, season after season, week after week, displayed a special kind of patiently maintained order, the whole great household sustained by a steady and careful flow of coins. Underneath the buying activity, the land kept sending its products unceasingly. As working farms, the estates dealt not only in rents and coins, but brought the very necessities of life to whichever manor she happened to reside in. Horse carts, loaded with sacks, filled at distant granaries, rumbled in. Livestock plodded slow miles along the roads, bred and fattened, then walled into preservation barrels at the right season, becoming winter stores. Poultry came in baskets, butter and cheese, wrapped and boxed, all gifts from her expansive fields. Over those estates, trusted officers oversaw cultivation, collected produce, and sent it out. One man, John Bedtime, devoted much effort to supervising her direct estates, ensuring their dues arrived in full and good quality. Thus, the manor was fed from two directions at once, purchased and homegrown, bought and grown, meeting finally in the same cool larder. Until you could scarcely tell down which path any loaf or cut of meat on the table had come. Sometimes I think the best way to understand a large household is as a mouth. Not a greedy mouth, but a mouth that never stops. It must be filled every day without argument or delay. The lord and lady at the main table are the family's symbols remembered by history. But beneath them, unrecorded by history, is the endless supply work, the people running on roads in any weather, carts grinding back from markets, fish carefully counted on flagstones, heavy sacks dragged into darkness. All the polished life in the great hall stands upon this, like a candle depends on the fat it burns, and it never stops. A manor may go a while without music, guests, or fine dress, but never, never without food. Think of the fish, for example. They tell their own story. The church prescribed many meat-free days in the year, fasting days, and a devout family like this one followed them strictly. So fish was not a rarity, but a constant need, demanded in great quantities week after week. Some arrived dried hard, as boards wind-dried fish that would keep months and had to be beaten and soaked before cooking. Some were herring, preserved in wooden barrels. They were caught by the thousands along the east coast, then shipped inland to feed half a country through the cold. Where possible, fresher and finer fish arrived too, like salmon and eel from the river, procured by a servant named Hugh Le Play. His long task was to learn where to find the best fish and what prices were fair. All this depended on salt, which, in the slow, long inland journey, prevented spoilage. Through salted barrels and blocks of dried fish, the sea reached even here in this flat, dry inland heartland, miles from any view of the coast. Some things came from even farther than the sea. For example, wine. Malt liquor was made at home from the manor's own malt, plain, everyday, English. But wine was a traveller. Most wine came by ship crossing the ocean from warm southern lands in Gascony, home to vast vineyards. It travelled in heavy wooden barrels, up rivers, over rough roads, to inland manors like this one. A man named John de Sotherham was in charge of buying wine, and sometimes the lady herself sent her own steward on long southwest journeys, all the way to the coast and beyond, to ensure the finest wine was bought at the source. Farther still were spices, pepper, ginger, and such tiny and costly, worth far more than their weight. They crossed half the known world, carried by hands she would never meet, ending their travels as a warm seasoning trace on a dish at her table. As for finer goods and crafts, those roads always led to London. No market near Clare could supply all a lady of status might want. A trusted attendant named Corinda Morley spent years making one long journey after another to the city. She oversaw cloth, supervised as it was cut smooth, then brought it home slowly by cart. She bought things impossible to find in country markets: fine cloth and shoes, embroidery threads, even keys and small hardware. Whatever the manor and lady needed and only the city could provide, she brought home. London was a vast hub of crafts and imports, spices, silk, and delicate handiwork gathered in the crowded city and then spread out along the roads to manors like this one. Sending someone to London meant entering that rich, complex centre, selecting exactly what was needed, then bringing it back by cart, crossing hills and valleys, returning to the deep quiet of Suffolk. Pause and feel it. There is a lovely wonder in all this. In the same pot on the same evening, a herring from a neighbouring county could meet a peppercorn that crossed half the globe. Near and unimaginably far, in this flat green corner of England, cooked together in one kitchen. The diners probably thought nothing of it. To them, pepper was just expensive, and herring was just cheap. That's all. But outside, the world was far wider than what the kitchen door showed, and the carefully run household reached out through markets and ships, gathering pieces of that vast world to one wooden board. All this movement was not fast. In an age when goods can now fly overnight to our hands, this is the hardest thing to grasp. Everything here arrived at horse-drawn cart, pack-horse, or riverboat speed, roughly a human walking speed, and often a whole day's travel. Roads were poor, muddy in rain, rutted and hard in sun. A cartload might take many days on the road. Drivers covered goods in rough hides to keep off rain and moved slowly, praying the wheels held. Where possible, heavy goods went by water, barges carrying more than any cart and moving more smoothly. So wine, grain, and bulky stuff took waterways as far as they could, and only the last leg on broke-down roads. The whole supply chain was a test of patience. You either ordered early or got nothing. Once everything arrived, almost nothing was allowed to be wasted. One of the kitchen clerks, William de Burgh, was responsible for selling excess kitchen refuse, and his record was a vivid lesson in thrift. Skins from animals eaten, sheepskin, even young rabbit hides, fat skimmed from the top when cooking, all could be sold to tanners, parchment makers, candle makers, soap cooks. So the kitchen, which consumed so much, gave back a little by ensuring even tiny scraps from the gathered world were not thrown away. A thrifty household counted pennies both ways, what came in and what careful selling rescued from waste. By the end of such a day, the cellar was a little fuller than before. A cart arrived from some market, unloading into the dark. Where the floor was bare at dawn, new barrels now stood. Outside, night came early over the flat fields, and the roads that brought all these supplies were empty now. Drivers went home, horses returned to the stables, and this day's slow traffic was done. In the cool rooms below, the year quietly continued storing itself for winter grain, salt, and the faint, far-off scent of the sea, waiting in the dark to be needed. The manor was well provisioned. That mouth was fed. Somewhere, a clerk wrote down in neat, small characters the last things brought in today. By noon, Clare's great hall began to fill with people. This was the heart of the manor, also the largest room inside so far, tall and long. At one end, there was a raised platform holding the main dining table, while smaller tables stretched out along the room's length below. Light streamed through the high windows in slow-moving beams, casting pale patches on the rush, straw-covered floor. Behind a folding screen at the lower end of the hall, doors led to the kitchen, the wine cellar, and the food pantry. From there came the sounds and smells of preparation, the clinking of plates, the servants' low voices, and the warm scents of baking and roasted meat. One by one, and then steadily more, the household arrived for the main meal of the day, which, in this time, was not evening, but near midday. Let's find a spot along the wall and quietly watch as they take their seats. The seating tells the whole story. Who sits where leaves no room for error? The entire order of the manor, matching the order listed in the servant rosters and the daily routine by which the household awakes each morning, is reflected in the arrangement of the tables here. By the raised main table, the lady of the house took the central seat of honour, flanked by her most distinguished guests. Below the platform, along the long tables running the length of the hall, the household arranged itself by rank. Senior servants sat closer to the main table, while lower-ranking staff took seats further back, the coachman and boys sitting at the farthest end. A huge salt cellar sat on the main table, and whether you sat above or below, it was itself a sign of your standing. Each person had a thick piece of coarse bread before them, called trencher bread, serving as a plate to soak up the juices of the meal, and often gathered afterward to be given to the poor. Everyone knew their seat without needing direction. Entering the hall was stepping into a world that knew your exact place and expected you to sit there. Before taking a bite, hands had to be washed. A household of this rank had an entire department, the washroom devoted to fresh linens and clean water for the table. At the start of the meal, servants carrying bowls, jugs, and clean towels approached to pour scented water over the lady and her guests' hands, since eating without washing was a sign of crude behaviour. Bread was then served, ale and wine poured, each task handled by specific servants, the bread keeper and the wine steward, with clear roles. The choicest meats at the main table were carved by skilled hands, and carving was an art with its own rules. In a well-run hall, the serving was always orderly and professional. Even on ordinary days, meals carried ceremony that made eating feel like a proper event, needing clean hands, fresh linens, and attentive staff. The elegance of the table was not just in the food, but in how it was served. Now, picture the kitchen behind that screen, working in heat and haste. A manor cooking for 60 was no gentle affair. Fires blazed. Large joints of meat turned slowly on spits by a boy sweating as he kept it from burning. Thick, rich stews simmered in pots over the fire, sending up steam. In the sauce room, sauces and spice blends were ground and mixed, for the meat medieval tables favoured strong sauces. Fresh bread came steaming from the bakehouse. On fasting days, fish were boiled or fried. Everything had to be ready at the same time, carried out, and placed in order before the diners. This was hard, hot, skilled work, done out of sight, to make the meal in the hall appear calm and unhurried. The grace and calm of the main table, like everything in the manor, was built on the unseen sweat beneath. As for what they normally ate, it was plentiful, simple, and tasty. There was always pottage, a thick stew made from grains, beans, whatever vegetables were on hand, and bits of meat served warm and filling. Those entitled to it had roasted and boiled meats, beef, mutton, pork, and common fowl. On many fasting days, Fish replaced meat, prepared boiled, fried, or in rich fish broths. Bread was always present, along with ale and beer to wash down the food. These two went with every meal. Food was served in tiers, with the best dishes reaching the main table first and the rest passed along the lower tables, so where you sat not only decided your place, but partly what you could eat. Most of the food was not refined, but it was hearty, hot, and constantly replenished, a significant thing in a difficult world. There is something to pause and consider in all this openness. We often think of eating as a private or family matter, something quiet among close ones. For this lady, nothing could be further from the truth. Meals were to be seen. The whole household ate together in this huge room, under one roof, with the lady presiding in the place of honour, not by accident, but by design. People of status in this time almost always lived under watchful eyes. Privacy, like we understand, it was almost non-existent, nor was it expected. The only truly private chamber was the bedchamber, and even that was shared with her maids. As lord or lady, you were watched at table, in prayer, at rest, and were always meant to act as one being observed. The banquets in the hall were a visible display of authority, day after day reflected in bread, salt, and the order of seating. On ordinary days, food was good, simple, and honest, but this household could pull off an astounding feast whenever it wished. Meat was never limited to beef, mutton, and common fowl. On fine days, the main table displayed high-status banquet birds, from medieval tables, herons and swans, roasted and sometimes redressed in their feathers, standing elegantly on the board. Fish, not commonly seen by ordinary folk, like pike, lampreys and sturgeon, appeared expensive and rare. Spices like ginger and pepper arrived from across half the globe, worked liberally into sauces to make plain just how wealthy the house was. Wine came from far-off, warm southern lands for the main table, while ale was passed below. It was all generosity with a purpose. Luxury at the table was not just for pleasure, but a clear yet subtle statement of influence and standing. Some days, it all rose to a grander level. The year moved with many feast days, and on the major festivals, the hall flaunted its full splendour. On Christmas, Easter, and other bright turning points in the church year, the ladies' spending on the table far exceeded ordinary meals, clearly visible in the old accounts, with festive dinners often costing several times a typical one. Among all these, one feast was her favourite, held in the warmth of early summer, when the household opened its purse more generously than almost any other day. On those days, the hall buzzed with noise. There might be music, bright and clear from a minstrel's harp, rising over the chatter. Entertainment was part of the lavish feast. Near the end, a dish called subtle sweets might be served marvels of sugar and dough, shaped into castles, beasts, or elaborate contraptions, valued as much for their wonder as their taste. The everyday order of rank, salt cellar, high and low tables remained, yet above it all hovered a bright atmosphere, a feeling of respect for the passing year and joy in the household. The lady presiding at the head was hosting a wealth she had spent a whole year preparing to share. Meals began and ended with God. Before eating, a grace prayer silenced the hall, with the priest's voice echoing around. After finishing, another grace gave thanks once more. Food itself was seen as a gift deserving response, part of which was that uneaten food on the main table was not arrogantly wasted. Leftover scraps of meat and trencher bread soaked with delicious juices were carried outside and given to the poor waiting there, just as they waited outside every noble house, hoping for charity from those with surplus. Feeding the poor with one's own table scraps was considered a basic duty, and a careful, devout lady made sure it happened. This charity was no afterthought, but the charge of a special officer. Great families hired an almoner, whose entire role was to collect leftover offerings and scraps and carefully distribute them to those in need. For several years, a man named Pierce de Ereswell served in this role for her keeper of charity. The poor came to the noble house's gate as surely as a cart came into its yard, knowing something would be shared, and a devout lady saw that sharing as one of her foremost duties before God. Where more arrogant households might toss scraps to dogs, here they were given carefully by the almoner to the hungry outside. The very table that showed guests the lady's wealth also fed her poorest neighbours at its far end, with no sense of contradiction. There are things here that may seem at odds with our own habits and merit some thought. The way this hall was open is unlike modern homes. Hospitality extended across all ranks. Family and honoured guests joined the main table, but clergy, manor officials, respected neighbours, and even on many days travellers and strangers needing a meal and a spot by the fire were welcome. Mendicant friars from the mountain town below, religious brothers long befriended and supported by the lady, were likely guests too. A great hall was not a closed, private space, but an open door, which was part of its greatness. Maintaining the generosity of the table, never turning away a decent stranger, was a mark of a lady worthy of her standing. When the meal ended and the second grace was said, the lady did not leave immediately. This was her habit, and the habit of all women like her, to stay and entertain for a while, to speak with this or that guest, listen to what someone wished to say, offer advice where needed. This was also part of dining, a gentle showing of presence to the people in her world. Sometimes a petition might be pressed here, a dispute laid out for judgment, or a small favour sought. The banquet in the hall was also a kind of court, where family and neighbourhood matters found her at her most approachable, well-fed, relaxed, and willing to listen. Over a long life, she had learnt just how many problems hard to solve elsewhere could quietly be settled at a table. Only when the talk was done did she rise from the main table, return with her ladies to a quiet, private chamber, leaving the hall to the slow work of clearing up, jesting. Afterward, the great room slowly emptied. The board floor was taken up and stowed away. These dining tables were usually wood planks, set on wooden frames, put up for meals and cleared afterward. The rush straw was trampled and scattered. A dog nosed around for dropped scraps. The household returned to afternoon tasks. The hall, once packed and noisy, was quiet again. Long shadows crept slowly over the empty floor as the food aromas faded into the older smells of stone and wood smoke. The day's grand public moment ended. The manor had fed itself, displayed itself, prayed over its plenty, and now settled back to its smaller, quieter labours of the afternoon. In the afternoon hours, after the grand public moments of the day had passed, the lady of the house withdrew into the only room in the estate that truly belonged to her, and the atmosphere became gentle. Her bedroom was smaller and warmer than the great hall, with the fire roaring brightly and light streaming softly through the windows at an angle. The Suffolk autumn afternoons were brief and golden, quickly fading away. Here, she did not need to perform or display herself. There was no main table, no crowd arranged by rank watching her every move. Only her female attendants were present, a small and intimate circle made up of those closest to her, along with the quiet handiwork in their hands and the long, pleasant hours before evening prayers. Among all the hours of her day, this was the time she reserved entirely for herself. Let us sit for a while in the warm corner of this room and see how a great noblewoman spends a quiet afternoon. The attendants around her were not strangers. Some had accompanied her through their own lifetimes, as well as much of hers. There was Susan de Necton and Anne de Lexton, who had served her for so many years that when the time came, she repaid them with gifts of silverware and fine clothing. Also, Margaret de Necton, one of her bedroom attendants, and the young Elizabeth Marshall, whose wedding the lady herself would attend, gifting her fabric and furs for the day. Among the dozens of men filling other parts of the estate, these women were a small group, but they were the faces she knew best, the people closest to her in the most important moments. Between a noblewoman and the women who dressed her, sat with her, and grew old beside her, a closeness grew that no official hierarchy could fully capture. A great noblewoman's bedroom, among other things, was also a school. Families with status had the custom of sending their daughters to be raised in the homes of higher-ranking noblewomen, where they would learn all the manners and education expected of ladies of noble birth. There, the girls learned fine needlework, household management, and the manners, conduct, and piety fitting their rank. They observed and imitated the women around them until those habits became their own. So among the ladies' attendants were both older and younger girls, the latter sent from neighbouring families and shaped under her watchful eye, learning things no book could teach. Being raised in the bedroom of a capable noblewoman was a lifelong point of pride for a woman, and for the lady herself, this meant her circle quietly renewed itself, elders teaching the young, with skill passed from one generation's hands to the next, within the bedroom over the years. Their hands were rarely idle. Afternoon was the time for fine needlework, a craft noblewomen excelled at and took genuine pride in. The embroidery threads were specially purchased, expensive items that could not be found at rural markets, carried all the way from London. The attendants slowly stitched beautiful patterns onto the fabric, flowers, leaves, birds, and sacred images, usually in coloured silks and sometimes with gold thread. An embroidery piece was months or even years of dedication, and its value reflected that a woman might leave some of her hand-stitched panels or vestments in her will as heirlooms. Watching them sew was like watching patience itself, needle rising and falling as the pattern grew stitch by stitch, accompanied by quiet, steady conversation. While they sewed, someone usually read aloud. Beyond religious devotion, the greatest entertainment of the time was romance stories. These were long tales about knights and ladies, adventures, and distant lands. As the attendants worked, these stories were read aloud in the bedroom, one voice carrying the story while others sewed and listened. Such books were rare and precious. Not every household had many, so they were both purchased and borrowed. A charming anecdote passed down to us tells how, in younger years, the lady and her sister each borrowed 4 romance novels from the king's private collection, together taking 8 adventure stories to read, enjoy, and return. Imagine that scene. 2 great noblewomen, sisters, sending someone to the royal library to request stories as casually as we might borrow a book today. The longing to be carried away by a good story is older than any of us, and was just as warmly present that firelit bedroom as anywhere. Some stories held special meaning for a family, woven into its pride. One noblewoman kept a history of the Swan Knight, because the swan was the emblem of her own family, and reading it was, in a way, reading the legend of her own bloodline. Romance was an escape into a brighter, braver world for a short time, yes, but it was also a mirror. Nobles liked to see themselves reflected there, courteous, brave, and touched by ancient magic. A noblewoman listening to such a story while sewing was gently reminded that the world she belonged to was the stuff of legend. On a quiet afternoon, few words could be more pleasing. I found this the gentlest and most genuine moment in her entire day. The lady in the hall was a public figure, a robed embodiment of authority watched and measured by everyone who saw her. But in this bedroom, among these few faces, quietly sewing, listening, and talking as the light faded, the woman was closer to an ordinary person, simply in a state of relaxation. Most of a noblewoman's life, despite all its grandeur, was spent at home, within this same small circle, moving through long and regular stretches between one duty and the next. The great days, feasts and travels were rare and brilliant flashes. This was the everyday foundation of her life, not made of splendor but of familiar company, useful work, and the sound of a story in a warm room. Surrounding this bedroom and serving it was the wardrobe, which stored some of the most valuable possessions in the entire estate. We have seen that in one sense the word means the department in charge of money and accounts. But it was also a real place, a group of chests and cupboards used to store fabric, furs and robes, and managing them was something that required care. Among all a large family's expenses, fabric and furs ranked near the top, their cost rivaling food. These were not trivial items to toss around. They were carefully folded and put away, aired out against dampness, guarded against moths, with the finest clothes treated like the treasures they were. Opening those chests meant breathing in the smell of fine wool and tanned furs, along with the fragrance of herbs placed inside to repel moths. The wardrobe did more than serve the lady herself. The estate's entire uniform came from its stock, fabric given by her generosity to everyone who served her, from knights down to the youngest pages. Following long-standing custom, fabric was issued twice a year, with each rank receiving the quality and colour appropriate for their station. So, in a way, the people in the estate wore the lady's own uniform, the fabric on their backs, marking them as hers. This was no small gift. Fabric was expensive, and supplying clothing for over 60 people was a heavy annual expense, faithfully recorded in the ledgers alongside food and wine. But it bound the estate's people together and displayed them as a whole, a large family draped in the lady's colours. When you met her people on the road or in town, you recognized them by their dress, and that fabric had come from those chests, gifted by her own hand. Much of the attendants' quiet work was devoted to keeping all this in good order, because fine fabric and furs did not take care of themselves. Clothes needed brushing, airing, and mending. Small tears were repaired before they grew bigger. Loose trims were carefully sewn back into place. Underclothes worn next to the skin had to be washed frequently, and that endless laundry work, as always, fell to the lower-ranking laundresses. But the more delicate care carefully folding and storing fur-lined gowns, airing robes before great occasions, and preserving precious items belonged to the bedroom attendants, who handled the lady's clothes with a confident ease born of long familiarity. Dressing a noblewoman properly was itself a skill, practiced quietly by these women. Consider the furs, because they tell you how far this world reached into a noblewoman's bedroom. The warmest and richest was squirrel fur, countless small pelts sewn together as linings. Many came all the way from the cold lands around the Baltic Sea, where harsh winters made the fur thick and fine. There was also lambskin, more common but warm, used as lining in simpler clothes. At the top, by custom and almost by law reserved for the most eminent figures of the land, was ermine the white winter fur, with black spots worn by kings, queens, and the highest nobility. A noblewoman wore fur not just for warmth, though the stone rooms were cold enough, but as a quiet badge of identity. paired with fabric, the finest English wool in the kingdom, carefully spun and dyed dark, and for the most exquisite occasions, silk brought from far away, so costly only the great nobles could afford it. All of this created the robes themselves, and a noblewoman of her rank kept a small number of the finest garments, her ceremonial robes brought out only on major days. The difference between her everyday robes and one of these special robes carried a world of meaning. Plain daily robes were for everyday life, warm, good quality, but unobtrusive. The ceremonial robes, dark, fur-lined, sometimes embroidered or trimmed with rare furs, were worn at feasts before important guests, on the grandest days of the year, to be a noblewoman in the fullest sense. In an age without photographs or self-promotion, what you wore spoke loudly and instantly. Wearing was declaring. And the few finest robes carefully protected in the wardrobe were the loudest declaration in the silent language she spoke every day. If you think her life was only quiet, all needlework, prayers, and the same few faces, you would be wrong. There were livelier notes too, though less frequent, and mostly falling on the major festivals of the year when the estate shed its usual stillness. Those were times for music, dancing, and games. Minstrels were invited, a harpist sitting among the estate's people through the long Christmas season, the delicate, clear harp strings sounding above the chatter. Some old and joyful customs were preserved. Around the feast day of a certain saint in December's darkness, in the tradition kept by the lady's own family, a boy might be dressed as a mock bishop and given this one-day honorary rank, making everyone smile, while she simply took a few coins from her bedroom purse. At Christmas, there was also drama, with actors from nearby villages performing their plays in the great hall. These were bright beads strung on the grey thread of ordinary days, cherished all the more for their rarity. There were pleasures, too, that now belonged more to her memories than the afternoons she had. In her younger, livelier years, she kept her own hawks, served by falconers. She sent for good birds from coastal towns, and perhaps once rode out with a hawk perched on her wrist in the sharp air. But that was the sport of a younger woman, and after she passed 50, hawking quietly vanished from her accounts, just as such things fade away when the body calls for gentler pleasures. Now left to her were quieter joys, those not requiring strong arms, needlework, stories, warm bedrooms, and the low voices of women she seemed to have known forever. There was no sadness in this, only a long life naturally settling into its later, quieter comforts. The afternoon passed away in softness. The light by the window shifted from gold to grey. The story reached a pause, the reader's voice quieting, the needlework slowed. Somewhere soon the bell would call them to evening prayer, but not yet. Now there was only the fire, faces flickering in the glow, and half-finished embroidery on laps. In the gathering dusk, the lady sat among her attendants, in no hurry to move, resting in the warm, still heart of her estate, letting the peaceful moment carry her gently toward evening, just as it had carried her through 10,000 such afternoons before. The afternoon slowly slipped into the depths of dusk, and another kind of work came before the lady of the house. It was quieter than the business in the hall, and heavier than needlework. Documents were brought to her, letters, files and reports, while a clerk waited nearby, with pen, ink and sealing wax. The light was fading, and to fend off the encroaching night, new candles were lit so she could read. Despite the prayers, embroidery and gentle moments, the most important thing was that this woman was the mistress of a vast inheritance, and a mistress must rule. The land would not run itself. The people on the land would not govern themselves. Day after day, year after year, she devoted herself to long, unglamorous tasks of ruling. Let us watch her handle these matters, for here we see her true power. Most of it started with letters. In a time when nothing travelled faster than a rider on horseback, letters were the ties that held a scattered inheritance together. Her estates stretched across the country, and even further, some near, some requiring days of travel, so she could not be everywhere at once. Therefore, she ruled largely through writing. Letters from distant officials arrived in streams, telling her how the harvest was, the output of a farm, where trouble had occurred, what needed her decision. In response, letters went out from her with instructions, rulings, questions, and requests, each carried by a messenger who vanished into the fading light. Her household accounts show that year after year, these letters came and went without pause, forming a silent nervous system reaching far beyond her line of sight. In that age, a letter was a weighty thing, never sent lightly. It was written out neatly by a clerk, then folded and sealed with her own wax seal, a stamp as clear, a sign of her authority, as if she had spoken the words herself. Then the letter was handed to a messenger who rode along the same rough roads as a handcart might, perhaps taking days to arrive, and then several more to return with an answer. The speed of communication was the speed of a tired horse and no faster. So to rule by letter was to rule with patience and foresight, to send messages at the right time, and then wait for the world to catch up. A decision made tonight in this candlelit room might not take effect at a faraway estate for a week or more. The whole machine of her rule moved to the rhythm of horses' hooves in the mud, and she had long since learned to rule within that slowness, as anyone who has ever governed anything must. To help her manage all this, she kept a council. These men were not great lords, but skilled and experienced in law and business. They were her advisors, familiar with the estates and their complexities, capable of advising on difficult matters. One was a man named Thomas de Chedworth, who sent her detailed reports about the affairs under his charge. The whole governance of the estates turned on such patient, careful letters. When a decision was needed, whether over rights, land disputes, or settling someone, she and her council would weigh it together. She did not rule alone, just as a king did not rule alone. She ruled. The advisors gave counsel. The lady made decisions. What she decided was carried out. I want to pause here, because this is the part of her life most easily overlooked and perhaps the most remarkable. We are used to thinking of medieval power in terms of swords and horses, of men in armour. But here was a completely different kind of power, held by a woman over 50, sitting at a desk by candlelight with a stack of letters. She ruled thousands of acres, and the lives tied to them. She commanded officials, balanced accounts, settled disputes, and made decisions shaping whole regions, all through judgment, the pen in her hand, and a steady authority born of knowing her affairs inside out. It was a rule without pomp or spectacle, quiet, everyday, efficient, and the signs made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. How did so much power fall into the hands of a woman? That is worth understanding. She was a great heiress, one of 3 sisters, who inherited a vast estate after the family's male line died out and their brother passed away young. This division made each sister wealthy beyond what a typical country gentleman could dream of, and her share was practically a miniature kingdom. Estates spread across the eastern counties and reached as far as the Welsh border to the west, producing in good years almost unimaginable income. It was not something she chose. It came from birth and the harsh odds of who lived and who did not. But having it, she held on tightly and held it well, making it the great work of her life. A weaker woman might have let such a patrimony slip through careless fingers, but she gripped it with both hands, ruling every acre as though it was vital because to her it was. At the root of it, what she ruled was people. The land was not empty ground, but a world of tenants who held leases from her, worked the soil, and owed her rent and labour according to ancient customs. In return, she owed them something too. On her behalf, courts functioned on the estates, resolving disputes and upholding local customs. The relationship between lord and tenant was a contract, unequal but real. Obligations ran both ways. Tenants owed their produce, she owed order, justice, and protection. A good lord, or lady, was one who could uphold her side of the contract. She would not squeeze her people beyond endurance. She kept peace on her lands and stood between her tenants and a harsher world. It was not equality, but it was meaningful. The best among these great landowners understood their duties as clearly as their profits. Picture one of those estates in your mind, and the contract becomes clear. Tenants leased strips of farmland and thatched cottages by ancient custom, owing a mixture of coin rents, produce rents, and often labour-meaning days, working on her fields to keep their own leases secure. Once or twice a year, courts were held in her name where local customs were upheld, neighbourly disputes settled, dues set, and wrongs corrected. This was village law, close, local, and old, and guarding it was her duty. A steward, or an officer under him, would oversee the courts, and the whole small community would gather. These slow workings of rural justice took place here just as they had for a long time visible to any living memory. For most of her people, this was what her lordship meant. She was not a distant grand lady, but the court in the manor and the customs it protected. Between her bedroom and that village court ran an entire chain of officials. Every estate had its people. A reeve chosen from among the tenants oversaw the daily work of the land. Above him, a bailiff was responsible for the profits. Above multiple estates, a steward rode from estate to estate, held courts, and kept the lower officers honest. Each estate handed in accounts yearly, which were audited and checked for waste, theft, or careless mistake, just like household accounts were checked. Profits once gathered were brought to her receiver, an official handling large cash inflows, who then sent money on time to supply the household and bedrooms. It was a long chain, from men bent in the furrows to the lady reading by candlelight, and every link was watched. At the far end sat a woman who could fairly accurately tell the value of every single acre in her vast inheritance. Above the tenants, bound to her by finer ties, were her followers, knights, gentlemen, and useful men who saw her as their lady. To these she owed and accepted the so-called good governance of the age. She could grant positions in her household, speak to the powerful, promote promising men, protect her followers in disputes, and ensure those who served her were not forgotten. A special privilege was close at hand: the right to present a priest to a church. A great landowner usually held a parish's so-called advowson, the right to recommend a cleric to the church, which was a real and valuable gift, a way to provide livelihood for someone worthy or reward the son of a loyal servant. Being a great lady meant having favours to give, and giving them wisely, drawing gratitude and loyalty back to herself. That was a big part of the art of rule. Her people came to her. The great lady's hall and chambers saw constant streams of those wanting something: a tenant wronged, a servant hoping for advancement, a neighbour seeking her word to someone greater. Part of being a good lady was simply being approachable to hear such requests and lend the weight of her name to those who looked up to her. A woman of her rank could open a door closed to lesser folk with a single word and she spent her influence carefully as she spent coin, knowing every gracious favour bound one more soul a little closer to her. That gathered loyalty was in the end the truest wealth a big family could have. It is tempting to think all this rule, courts, patronage, command over men must be somewhat different in a woman's hands, less, or borrowed, or just held in trust for a man. It is not so. The rule of a great widow worked just the same as that of any lord, by the same letters, the same counsel, the same courts, the same webs of favour and protection. Her tenants owed her as much as they owed a baron. Her followers looked up to her as they would a count. The power was the same power, wielded exactly the same way, responsible to no husband, because she had none. In this one regard, widowhood gave her something back for what it took away. She answered only to the king and to God, and ruled what was hers as fully as any living man. Running through all this, never fully separated from it, was care for her own bloodline. A great lady was the heart of a wide family, and that family never strayed far from her letters. She had children, though a woman of her rank did not tend them herself. That was the work of designated nurses and tutors, but she cared deeply for their upbringing, schooling, and most of all, their marriages and futures. Sending children away to be brought up elsewhere was common, in monasteries, schools, or other households, returning only now and then. So her own children went out into the world to be shaped just as others came to her. Years ago, when affairs called her westward, she left her young daughters at Clare, a hard but ordinary calculation in a life that could not be in two places at once. Now older, she sat by the candle's flicker and watched over the next turns of her family's fortunes by letter and word, marriages to weigh, relations to help, the great family she was born to, with all its branches and rents and estates, kept in her mind. She did not see her family and her estates as two things. They were one. Land was held for blood, and blood was fed by the land. Much of her rule was simply that, keeping the inheritance whole and strong, and passing it well to those who would come after. Her sisters, and the other heiresses of their great name, were threads in the same broad cloth. Cousins near and far were parts of the single fabric she cared for. To her, ruling well and caring well for her people were not two duties, but one, and she gave herself to both with the same steady and unemotional love. By now, the candle burned bright against the fully dark window. The last letter was read, the final decision given, the wax warmed and pressed, and the seal stamped. A messenger would carry it away in the first light of dawn. The clerk put away his papers. The files were stacked. The great quiet work of this day, that rule with no monuments, no battles won, and almost entirely forgotten by history, was done for another day. The lady stayed a while longer by candlelight, as mistress of it all, setting down the work while night quietly began to fall. Autumn nights came early, and the night had fully settled over Clare. Beyond the castle walls, the fields faded into darkness, and a chill descended on the land, making the rooms warmed by the hearth feel more precious and cosy than ever before. The major public affairs of the day had been left behind by her. After a dinner lighter than the grand meal at noon, enjoyed once the household had quieted down, candles were lit in all the rooms still in use, while the rest of the castle slowly sank into shadow. This was the gentlest part of the day for the lady of the house, the long, slow winding down toward rest, which, like many things in her life, began with giving. Let us follow her through this last hour and see how this ordinary day came quietly to an end. At the main gate, the poor were given food. This was a custom of every great household and a responsibility the church strongly imposed on the rich. Leftover food from the house should not be wasted, but shared with those who had nothing. So the day's scraps, cold dishes, bits of bread, and the good things left in pots were brought to the gate where the local poor waited, knowing, as they had always known, that a devout family would share. Even how this was done was carefully considered. Years earlier, a wise cleric had warned a grand countess to make sure her alms truly reached the poor, sick, and beggars, and were not quietly taken by lazy servants along the way. A good noblewoman ensured her charity was real. Feeding the hungry with one's plenty was considered one of the clearest orders given to anyone who possessed more than they needed, and she had plenty, so she gave. On certain special days, this charity was more generous and deliberate. Throughout her long years of widowhood, it was her habit to make special distributions on particular calendar days, handing out fixed portions of bread and herring to the poor. This was a small but steady act of kindness, repeated faithfully across the turning years. Among these days was one she kept to remember someone lost long ago. Every spring on that day, bread and fish were given out in his name, so those he fed could pray for his soul, and his memory passed quietly on in the gratitude of strangers. There was tenderness in this, a blend of charity and remembrance, serving the dead by feeding the living. Giving in someone's name made them live a little longer in this world, and throughout her life she held on to those she loved with this kindness. In these nightly alms, I find the truest answer to all the wealth that flowed through this household. We see carriages arriving, warehouses full, fine furs and wines from long journeys, and the rents collected from hundreds of estates. It's easy to only see the grandeur and call it greed. But it was the very same gate that absorbed all the world's wealth, that every evening returned bread to the darkness for any hungry soul who came. This was no accident, no afterthought. In the deep, shared understanding of that age, all knew, the more you are given, the more you owe. Wealth carries responsibility just as surely as a carriage carries its load. She would never call herself generous. She would only say she was merely loyal, doing what anyone in her position must do. Perhaps that is an even better word. Indeed, the alms of a great household seemed tiny compared to its wealth, just some bread and fish beside all the wine, furs, and vast lands. No one then thought it should be otherwise. But whether small or great, this giving was real and daily. For the poor souls fed at the gate, it was no small thing. On some nights, it was the difference between hunger and having enough. At night, the doors of the house opened wider than we might expect. Besides the poor at the gate, there were guests by the table and the fire, many of them God's people. Hosting the religious community near where she lived, and the monks and nuns from nearby abbeys, was her steady habit. Mendicant friars from Clare town itself, as well as nearby Sudbury, sometimes even from farther off Colchester, Ipswich, and Norwich, received a meal and a welcome on their journeys. When she lived in her other estates, it was the same. A monk from one abbey, a nun from another, took turns as her honoured guests. And not only the holy were welcome. A travelling priest, a passing merchant, a stranger who left no name, might all find a meal and a bed in her hall, rarely questioned on who they were or where they were going. Keeping the doors open and not turning away any decent soul who came after dark was deeply woven into the meaning of living greatly and well. Her connection to the religious was far deeper than just one evening's welcome. In the fullest sense, she was also a lady patron of the church, a donator and protector of the religious orders, foremost among them the mendicant friars of her own Clare town, whose church was closely tied to her family and resting place of its dead. Year after year she gave them money and goods, and in return she expected prayers said for the souls of the great household. To her, supporting such a monastery was no separate thing from her role as a lord, but part of it, a sacred response to the secular, paying for prayers that guarded the wealth gathered by her officials. It was expected of a great noblewoman to be a pillar of the church in her area, and she was that pillar, a generous one who prayed and cared for this world with both hands throughout her life. Occasionally, her evening companions were more distinguished. Women of her birth did not only host mendicant friars and the poor, sometimes one of the greatest men of the land might be her guest, a duke or even a prince with royal blood, sitting beside local monks from humble abbeys at her table, because, let us not forget, she was a granddaughter of a king and holder of a vast inheritance in the kingdom, and the powerful knew her worth. Yet the same table that had welcomed princes might on another night host an unknown traveller who was there purely by charity's grace. This was the breadth of a great hall. It could hold the highest and lowest of this land in a single week without turning either away. Not only the holy and strangers ate at her expense, the labourers around the estate also received food as a matter of course. Carters and roofers, carpenters and ploughmen, even women who came to gather fresh rushes for floors, all were fed in the hall as part of the estate's plain custom. To work even one day for a grand noblewoman meant she provided food, and the hall quietly welcomed them alongside everyone else. Through these small but lasting acts of kindness, the night softened toward its close. Guests in the hall dispersed. The fire was banked low. The household slowly withdrew, the coachmen to their corners, the women to bedrooms, great rooms one by one becoming quiet and dark. In the lady's own bedroom, the fire burned low and warm, a single candle pushing back the dark. The long labours of the day, prayers, reckonings, rule, and giving were all behind her now. Nothing remained undone. Just the warm room, the low hearth, and time at peace. Every night, this place was made safe. A great household was also a small fortress, and the dark was not always friendly. Outer gates were barred and keys put away. Watchmen might be set, one or two staying awake while the rest slept, the chief concern being fire. Every house built with so much wood inside stone feared fire above all. The hearth was banked low, not put out, but covered to a safe red glow, ready to be awakened before dawn. Doors were shut, shutters pulled down, candles in empty rooms snuffed one by one. Bit by bit, the lively, busy house of the day folded itself into the still and guarded state it became each night. Above it all, in her bedroom, the lady let the last light burn longer than the others. It is worth noting how her day united its secular and sacred halves with no conflict. She spent it as a great lord, commanding people, money, and land. She also lived it as a devout woman, praying in the cold before dawn and giving alms in the darkness after dinner. To us, these might seem like two very different lives, powerful and pious, awkwardly joined. To her, they were seamlessly one. Wealth was a gift from God and accountable to God. Power was a trust to be loyally exercised. Prayer and charity were not escapes from lordship, but its truest expression. She saw no seam. To her, none existed. Above all the alms, there was a gift combining care for the sacred and for the future. Far away in Cambridge, where young people gathered to learn, she had poured her heart and fortune into founding a college, a hall for scholars that would long outlast her life, bearing her name and purpose. Funding such a place was among the greatest things a person of her wealth could do, a way of turning a lifetime fortune into learning and prayers that would continue for many generations. after the giver turned to dust. She would provide vestments for its chapel, tableware for its meals, and means of support for its scholars, building it strong enough to stand for centuries. Perhaps among all her acts in a long life, this was the one she hoped would have the deepest impact the flame kindled in her own age, aimed to burn on endlessly if it could. Before sleep came the last prayer of the day. The church set prayers for evening as well as dawn. The prayers said as light faded were the vespers, and the final night prayer was Compline, the quiet prayer closing the day and entrusting coming sleep to God. Just as mornings began with prayers said in the dark, so did nights end, with these long-standing familiar words threading hours into a close. She might go once more to the small chapel adjoining her bedroom, or pray where she sat by the fire, her ladies nearby. Either way, the day's cycle was done and closed. It began in prayer and ended in prayer, and through all the long crowded time between the waking house, the full carriages, the grand hall, the warm bedroom, the letter by candlelight, all was gathered up and put down, laid before the same God she greeted before dawn. In her bedroom around her lay the things left by a long life, the bed with its curtains, chests, and small precious possessions accumulated over many years. Some she had quietly and thoughtfully promised to that college she longed to build far away in Cambridge. She wanted to leave it her bed where she now slept and the splendid vestments of her chapel so that her care for it would go on long after her death, and scholars she would never see would sleep and pray among the things once hers. It was a way of reaching beyond the end of her life, a giving that let time keep flowing after time ran out. But that was for another year. Tonight, this fine bed belonged to her alone, warm in the glow of the last firelight, waiting. Now there was only one candle left, a tiny flame, twin to the one she saw burning on a cold morning just hours ago, the last light still burning in this dark, great house. The mansion was quiet. The hearth was ash. Outside the walls, fields were black and still, rivers flowing unseen beneath them as they did before dawn, and as they would after she was gone. At last, she was ready to sleep. The candle was brought to her bedside, and for a moment its tiny glow filled the whole room, the carved bedposts, the curtains, and the quiet face of a woman, as an ordinary and extraordinary day came to its end. The flame was gently blown out. Darkness flowed in, soft and complete. In the midnight silence, the Lady of Clare lay down to rest, and the vast household she ruled slept safely, peacefully, intact around her. She is there, peacefully asleep, the Lady of the House Clare, in a dark and quiet mansion from over 600 years ago. The candle has gone out. The fields lie silent. Everyone who belongs to that vast household resting on her shoulders, the cooks and clerks, the maid in her bedroom, the boy tending the horses, the poor fed outside the gate, all have fallen asleep under the same roof on the same autumn night. They are all gone now, each and every one of them, the lady and her people, vanished so long ago that even the stones have mostly forgotten them. But for a little while tonight, we stand among them, watching a simple day quietly pass by, which, in itself, is a small way of keeping it alive. Just think about how much it takes to live even a day like this, prayers whispered in the cold, carriages making their way on muddy roads, bread and ale, that long line of carefully checked numbers, open doors, and whole loaves given to charity. None of these things were grand while being done. It was just life, faithfully upheld, passing through quiet moments one after another, Perhaps that is the gentlest gift the past can give us, a reminder that beneath all the famous names and dates, those centuries, like our own days, were made up of small and ordinary moments, of people doing their work and a candle lit quietly in the dark. If, as you lie here listening, there is some small thing that touches you, a detail, a feeling, your own thought, you are warmly invited to leave a few words about it below. Whenever you happen to wake up, no rush at all. It can wait until morning. Sometimes, just knowing that someone else wanders these ancient and silent rooms tonight is a quiet kind of joy. This is a small channel and a slow one whose only grand purpose is to help you rest. Slowly, we intend to wander through all eras this way, a night in the Middle Ages, a day in ancient Egypt, a long evening in ancient Greece, telling their quiet, ordinary, mostly forgotten stories in the rhythm of breathing. If these journeys bring you some calm, you are warmly welcome to follow our footsteps, to grow old with us, and to keep you company through gentle nights. We are simply glad you have come tonight. But for now, there is nothing left that must be done, and nowhere you need to go. The lady sleeps in her old, shadowed mansion. The candle has gone out. The long day is over, completely over, and the night will keep watch without any worry from you. So let your breathing slow down. Let the last moments of this day settle. When you are ready, let yourself drift into sleep alongside her. Rest now. Sleep well,